Good morning, everyone. So far we have looked at the war being fought by armies along the many fronts of World War II. The war, however, was a total war, which meant that the entire population was involved, even in those areas where the fighting wasn't taking place. This was especially true for those populations that lived under Nazi occupation and who had to endure not only the hardship of the war, but also the terrifying prospect of living day to day next to the Nazi invaders. It is not surprising, then, that the resistance movement against Nazism began forming in many countries, including Germany itself. Today we will discuss a few of them, keeping in mind that resistance movements spawned all over Europe and that we will not have time to see them all. For example, I would love to talk about the Italian resistance movement, but we will not have time to do that. In particular, we are going to look at the following points. We're going to see the story so far. What was the situation in Europe in 1943? Then we ask ourselves, why were people resisting the Nazi occupation? It should be an obvious question, but we should look into it. Then we'll look at the resistance in Germany, at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, then at resistance in Germany, and finally we'll ask ourselves, how did the resistance movement help? And finally, I will read you a model answer to the question, how did people resist to Nazi occupation? So, the story so far, Europe in 1943. In our last lesson, we looked at the events that took place in 1944 and 45, so the D-Day landing and the Dresden bombings, when Germany's attempt at establishing a total domination over Europe began to crumble under their own weight. But we don't have to forget that many people believed that Germany would win the war, and it is difficult to blame them for this idea. They did not know, as we do, we from the future know, that the resources of the country were stretched extraordinarily thin, okay? And they only saw the daily reality of their lives, in which the Nazis bossed around pretty much everyone in Europe. In 1943, it really did look like Germany was about to win the war. It had occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Italy. See the map to understand the extent of this occupation. Also, before their defeats in the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk in Russia, it really looked like they were about to conquer the entire Soviet Union as well. So they really looked unstoppable, especially from the perspective of the normal people who lived under their occupation. But again, why did they resist? The understatement of an answer would be that the Nazis were not kind in their occupation. They controlled the local government and used the local resources to support the war. This meant imposing high taxes on the occupied peoples and often even requisitioning, meaning stealing in the name of the government, their food and resources to supply the army. But this was far from the worst, and pretty much everybody did that. Everybody did the requisitioning, and military occupations generally are not kind. For example, the British, when they arrived in my hometown, they requisitioned my grandfather's pasta manufacturing equipment in 1944 because it was made of metal and they needed it for military purposes. The Nazis, however, were on a different level of brutal. Okay, they rounded up everyone who was suspected of being part of a resistance movement or of hiding fugitives or of being an enemy of the Nazi state. Rounded up people would often be sent to concentration camp, or if they were Jewish, Roma, homosexuals, or Jehovah's Witnesses, they would go to extermination camps, which we'll look at next week. Often, they were just simply shot. The members of the resistance movements who were captured by the Nazis were also interrogated and tortured, okay, in order to extract information from them. After the torture, they would be led to isolated places and shot to the head. Now, violence, as you could see, was very, very problematic. Okay, but it was not just limited to resistance fighters. Okay, normal civilians were also the victim of massacres. Sometimes, if the resistance killed a German soldier, the Nazis would make reprisals by killing 10 civilians for every soldier who had been killed. And for example, in Italy, there were several very strong reprisals against the civilian population, which could kill at about 150 people in certain occasions and even more in certain others. Other times, the massacres were not reprisals, were not done in reaction to something that had been done to them, but they were simple act of racist cruelty, okay? This was I'm reading you a passage from the instruction handbook for the training of Nazi soldiers in Russia about how to treat the local population. The objective of this Battle of Russia must be the demolition of present-day Russia and must be therefore conducted with unprecedented severity. Every military action must be guided in planning and execution by an iron resolution to exterminate the enemy remorselessly and totally. In particular, no adherents of the contemporary Russian communist system are to be spared. What does this mean? If you want to kill a Russian, just go ahead and do it because they are inferior people, they are communists, they deserve to die. The entire ideological system of Nazi Germany rested on their alleged racial and moral superiority, and since the other peoples were seen as inferior, as we said, by the Nazis, it was not considered morally wrong to kill them. It is unsurprising, then, that many people decided that armed resistance was the only reasonable way to deal with this oppression. While, as we said, there were resistance movements all over Europe, one of the most remarkable was the Jewish resistance movement in Poland, and especially in the capital city of Warsaw. The city had been almost destroyed to the ground during Nazi occupation, and the members of the local Jewish population were brutally oppressed. Initially, they were forced to live in a Jewish quarter called the ghetto, and little by little the Nazis rounded them up and sent them to the extermination camps. However, not everybody accepted to be a victim. Between the 19th of April and the 16th of May of 1943, the Jewish Fighting Organization of Warsaw decided to react with force to the violence of their oppressors. They staged a surprise attack against the Germans, which forced them to withdraw from the Jewish ghetto, at least for a while. It was a desperate act of heroism. More than 2,000 heavily armed German soldiers with artillery and flamethrowers against about 700 untrained Jewish teenagers who just had handguns, and just want to die as they lived, with honor. This was the motto of the Jewish resistance in Warsaw, to live and die with honor. For 28 days they held the Nazis at bay, but in the end they were forced to give in. The Nazis razed the Warsaw ghetto to the ground, burned many of its residents alive, and built a concentration camp in its place. However, resistance did not only happen in the occupied areas, and Germany too had its own resistance movements against the Nazi regime. They were not, however, like those that were taking place in other parts of Europe. They were not armed movements which used military means to achieve liberation. They were more small, underground movements which tried to get rid of Hitler and of the Nazi regime. Its leaders had political positions that were incompatible with Nazism. For example, many of them were Catholic, like Sophie and Hans Scholl, who founded the non-violent resistance movement known as the White Rose, or communist, who were generally supported by the Soviet Union. But since the communists were official enemies of the Nazi state, they had a much harder time creating an effective resistance movement. However, there were also members of the army staff who tried to kill Hitler several times, either because they disagreed with his military choices and they believed that he was leading Germany to catastrophe, which he was, or because they had become aware of the atrocities and the exterminations that Hitler had ordered to be committed. However, most historians believe that it was mostly a disagreement over military choices, since several of those commanders had actually signed extermination orders. Now, there were several plots, including one which used a German general as a suicide bomber, which actually never took place. But the most famous of these plots is the 20th of July plot, which is also my birthday, also known as Operation Valkyrie, in which a group of army officers, led by Klaus von Stauffenberg, tried to kill Hitler and failed. This happened in 1944, 20th of July 1944. They realized that the situation was hopeless for Germany and wanted to make peace with the Allies by removing Hitler and his men from power. How did they want to do that? How did they want to kill Hitler? It was a simple plan that could fail in many ways, and in fact it did. They put a bomb inside a briefcase to kill Hitler with the explosion. They placed the briefcase under a table during a meeting, but then someone accidentally moved it out of the way with their feet, ruining everything. The bomb exploded, but it exploded in the wrong place. Hitler was wounded, he was scared, but he was not dead. The plot had failed. Operation Valkyrie had failed. The Nazi secret police, called the Gestapo, you might have heard of them, arrested 7,000 people who were believed to be part of this plot and killed 5,000 of them. So, how did the resistance movements help? Now, while the resistance movements were generally not considered to be militarily fundamental in that for the military side of the war, even though all countries in Europe, except maybe for Yugoslavia, were liberated by the Allies and not by an internal resistance movement, we must absolutely not underestimate the moral and also military importance of the resistance. Resistance movements were useful for raising the morale of the population and by showing them that it was possible to rebel against the Nazis, to hit them where it hurt, that it was possible, as the Jewish rebels of the Warsaw Ghetto said, to live and die with honor rather than just to resign to being a victim. However, the resistance movements also helped the armies of the Allies. They were not doing another war, they were helping them in the war. For example, the actions of the resistance in Rome, in Italy, was able to keep around 7 divisions of the German army occupied in the city, busy hunting down the resistance, and we're talking about 50,000 men. Those divisions that were fighting against the resistance were not able to move south and fight against the Allies. Similar episodes happened all over Europe, and while the resistance movements by themselves were rarely able to fully liberate a country, they really helped by keeping up the spirits of the locals and by pinning down German troops. So, the question is, how did people resist to Nazi occupation? We got 3 levels of achievement. First one, bronze, describe at least 2 examples of resistance movement. So I've given you the ghetto uprising in Warsaw in 1943 and the internal German resistance movement. Silver, you got to do the bronze and also explain why the resistance movement opposed Nazism. So you might talk about the brutality of the German occupation. And finally gold, in which you have to do both the bronze and the silver and also explain how the resistance helped the people around them by raising the spirit up and by pinning down parts of the German army. So that was it for today. Let me know if you have any questions, and really looking forward to read what you can write. See you next time.